Welcome everyone to Tallan's Migrating Your Applications to Windows Azure. I'm excited about presenting this webinar for you today, and my hopes are to really provide some real-world examples and information to you today that will hopefully help you in your future cloud endeavors. So a little bit about me. I'm Stan Kennedy, as Monica mentioned. I'm practice lead for cloud and connected systems for Tallan. I have over 15 years of experience delivering enterprise solutions. Tallan is a member of the Windows Azure Circle program, and I'm also certified in Azure and have completed Operation Azure program with Microsoft. So let's dive right in. Today's agenda is Windows Azure right for you, planning the migration, steps for a smooth migration, tools that ensure success. I'll go through a demo of some tools, and then we'll take some questions at the end. So first, choosing Azure. So is Azure right for you? Now this presentation is really geared towards, you really made the decision to go to Azure, or you're right on the fence, and based on the migration of your current applications and how that process is going to work, you know, you're pretty much ready. But if not, I wanted to include a few slides that helped you along that decision-making process and give you some information. So we'll talk briefly about this. So Azure is a good choice, for example, if you have a web service that experiences traffic spikes. For example, a multi-tenant web service recently experienced significant web traffic spikes, almost 700% due to ads it ran. So traditionally, the only way to really handle such spikes is to over-purchase capacity in advance for the ads running. With Windows Azure, the web service doubled their Windows Azure compute capacity. It took a couple of minutes and the change to one of its XML configurations, and really Windows Azure took care of the rest. So pretty powerful stuff. Within a half an hour, the service validated via the logs that it had indeed doubled its capacity, and all the web servers were taking the traffic. The full cost for the burst capacity was about $70 and about 5 minutes of operation time. Also, Azure is a good choice if you regularly add products or services. Azure lowers the barriers to innovation. A new product or service added to the Azure platform can be technology ready within a short time, making it available to the market sooner. So if you regularly update your products and services, you want to go with a platform that lets you scale up or down with ease without having to invest a big budget and project schedule and a physical infrastructure. Also, consider Azure if your physical IT assets are being underutilized. So traditional on-premises or hosted solutions rely on forecasting the highest predicted workload. So you tend to over-anticipate your needs. But this over-provisioning leads to your assets being underutilized. With Azure, you only pay for what you use. Capacity can be reduced as you need to lower costs or dial up to meet that demand. The Windows Azure platform offers two types of flexible payment plans, the subscriptions, or that's the pay by month, and also pay as you go. Okay, I like to typically illustrate cloud computing by comparing a generator, shown on the left as your typical IT-hosted solution, with the receptacle which is presented on the right as cloud computing. On the left, if we decided to use a generator for power, we would need to plan for weeks and hope that we account for peak loads. Additionally, we will need to maintain that generator for performing oil changes, refueling, tune-ups, and repairs. So hopefully you can see some of the similarities there. So finally, that generator will incur extensive upfront costs. So what happens when that generator no longer meets your peak? Or it's too much and it's underutilized, and basically your maintenance is expensive at that point. So by contrast, cloud computing is represented as the receptacle. It has on-demand power, a common interface, pay only what you use, and no maintenance. Best of all, no upfront costs or extensive planning is required. Just add more on demand. Additionally, here are some helpful resources to help you make that decision if Azure is right for you. It's not right for everyone, so don't try to force a square peg in a round hole. My Azure security white paper, Is the Cloud Secure Enough? Will address any security concerns and help you guide if Azure really meets your security and compliance requirements. Typically, that's the first thing that comes up is security. So, also, our previous webinar recording is available online. It's called E-Commerce in the Cloud, where we do a deep dive on the benefits, security, and turnkey platforms. Finally, take a look at the many case studies on Microsoft's website. This webinar assumes that you're ready to take the Azure plunge or close to it, but you may not be sure where to start with migrations. Okay, so let's start talking about migrating. I'd like to kick it off with migration planning. So migration to Azure is no trivial task at all and should not be taken lightly or rushed into. The intent of this webinar is not only to combine Microsoft's best practices for that migration into one presentation, but to augment it with our experience and help provide you with real-world tips. So here are the components of the migration planning: total cost of ownership, or TCO, and ROI, billing and pricing models, risk versus reward, compliance, technical suitability, analysis and estimates, and then best practices and resource planning. So total cost of ownership. It's important to understand the total cost of ownership, or TCO. Even if cost is not the primary motivator, there are others, including reduced infrastructure support, for example. So you should always know what the cost comes out to. Calculate that TCO of the application running in Azure. You also want to normalize the TCO factors for your current application and data center into common terms such as monthly costs. Normalizing to monthly costs will help you do an apple-to-apple comparison to the cloud TCO. This can be one of the most challenging activities in the migration planning, to be honest with you. Fortunately, there are some tools, and they're free. There's, for example, TCO migration tools as free downloads. You can use a wizard-based application to determine your TCO, and the tool will give you a report that illustrates, the cloud versus on-premise TCO. One thing I like to mention is make sure you consider any cloud hidden costs. Hidden costs can eat away at your ROI and increase your cloud TCO. So I'll go more into that a little bit later in this presentation. So from time to time I get the question, I hear the cloud will provide no cost savings when it's all said and done. Is it cheaper to run my application in the cloud? Well, the simple answer is it depends. Furthermore, cost is not always a driver for moving applications to the cloud. Think of companies with limited IT staff resources, for example. Calculate your return on investment, or ROI, based on cloud TCO, on-premises TCO, the migration costs, including consulting services, hidden costs, and your application lifespan. So ROI has a direct correlation to the workload pattern your application will run as. Unpredictable bursting, predictable bursting, grow fast, and on and off play a huge role in how much ROI you can expect. These workload patterns must be considered in your TCO calculation and ROI. So, for example, if you have a retail e-commerce website that is seasonal based, your workload pattern falls under predictable bursting. So chances are you'll have a favorable ROI just because of the wasted resources required to maintain peak all year in your on-premise solution. Okay, next, billing. Billing is an important planning aspect. When you create your Azure account subscription, typically a credit card is required. And it's probably more appropriate to call Microsoft and get invoice set up. In the field, we've seen that one important aspect to consider is how this impacts your SDLC and deployments. So, for example, it may make more sense to have separate accounts for staging and production to manage and track those costs and also those accounts as well. A billing portal is available on Microsoft Azure website, and it enables you to check your usage and cost at any time. Additionally, a warning email is sent if there is extensive usage beyond your plan subscription. When you deploy your first application, make it a point to monitor the billing on a regular basis and make sure you're not incurring unexpected charges, or, as I call, leaving the faucet on. So, for example, if your staging application is deployed with 6 instances, you will incur those charges even if the instances are stopped. So that's one of the hidden costs as well. So just be familiar with those scenarios. We can help navigate what pricing model works best for you, especially regarding commitment level discounts. Take advantage of the free trials and member offers when possible. Okay, next, as with any migration, planning risk versus reward is very important with an Azure migration. Determine what your goals are or rewards. So, for example, do you have a limited IT staff and you can't maintain the level of enterprise-required maintenance for your on-premise solutions? Is time to market typically very long for deploying your on-premises applications due to hardware, resource planning, and limited staff to maintain? Or is cost your only reward? So knowing those goals for moving to cloud computing will ultimately play a big role in that decision process. Next, compliance. Simply put, some verticals of business are just not a good fit for Azure. There are ways to do hybrid implementations, cloud solutions for some, but for the most part, some are just not a good fit. You can be sure that the data on Microsoft's data center is secure. Microsoft has an ISO 27001 and SAS 70 Type 2 certifications that should make you feel at ease with putting your data on the cloud. I have an extensive write-up on this, and it will be available soon on the cloud security. So also check out our previous webinars I mentioned, e-commerce in the cloud, for an abbreviated security overview. At the end of the day, we must feel just as confident as you with the security, and I'm very confident with the measures that Microsoft is implementing. PCI compliance is an important aspect when your application is processing sensitive data such as credit card information. So with that, without getting too far into that, what we typically do is we utilize a hybrid. In a sense, it's still a pure cloud implementation, so we'll do a hybrid SOA application that serves up the payment processing service. Next, technical suitability. So determine if your application is technical suitable for a Windows Azure platform. There are many factors that can help you make your decision. Take advantage of the assessment tools mentioned later in this webinar to perform part of this task. Some of the biggies include platform. Do you have a Spring application, for example, running on Tomcat? Although there is an SDK for Eclipse for Azure, and by the way, Tallan has actually created an application on Azure as a proof of concept for that, but it's probably not a good fit. Consider Amazon EC2 for something like that, or for non-Windows platform and or complicated IIS configurations. Again, the Azure is a platform as a service, so you manage less is the whole idea around this. Does the current application's architecture migrate to the cloud without complex refactoring? That's another big one. Or does your application utilize BI and SQL jobs heavily? In the current state, SQL Azure doesn't currently support SQL Agent, for example, so we'll need to plan that accordingly. The next migration planning step is analysis and estimates. Careful analysis of your platform, environment, software components, and versions can play an important part in that migration. For example, the SDK 1.5 supports the latest Visual Studio, and 1.4 as well, by the way. There are older versions of that SDK that support previous versions, but keep in mind that the latest fixes and features may not be included. So an example for the 1.3 SDK, one of those being remote desktop in Azure. That's only supported in the 1.4 and the 1.5 SDK, just an example. Map your current solution to components in Azure. So for example, a scalable middle tier for business logic will be moved to a worker role compute Azure instance. The web interface will be mapped to a web role compute Azure instance. Analyze your operation costs and scope the project. Create development estimates and plug them into your project plans accordingly. Okay, let's talk about best practices. Certain Azure best practices should be considered, including design patterns. Also, state management is a big one. Keep in mind that Azure uses stateless storage paradigm, so for example, ASP.NET session management is not sticky between those web roles. So use something like SQL State Management or Azure Storage Services such as Table and Blobs. And a final alternative is utilize App Fabric caching. When using the SQL management, the state management, keep in mind that there are no SQL agent jobs to periodically clean up those sessions, so you'll need to handle that accordingly as well. If you have nightly batch processing, consider using worker roles compute instances. This enables you to scale all the resources you need, for example, at night, and reduce the processing time to a fraction of the time, and you won't underutilize your resources. Utilize queue processing when your application needs to process images, videos, or any content to blob storage services. Queuing will also reduce the load and an async behavior as well. Okay, the next item on the agenda, steps for success. So we'll go through this in a checklist fashion. Now that we've performed our exhaustive migration planning, let's review some of the checklist that's required. So first, complete that analysis and estimates and plan your resources. Next, migrate your SQL Azure database, so all your database and data from your on-premise systems, and there are also some considerations for large databases over 50 gigs, for example, sharding those. And then also plan your authentication. So for example, SQL Azure authentication doesn't support Active Directory or Windows authentication. It's SQL authentication only. Create cloud projects by tier, web versus worker roles. Next, move static content to storage services, for example, blobs, queues, and tables. That's the Azure services. Implement your session state, SQL Azure, table, blob storage, App Fabric cache. Put your logging and management in place. Now, this is especially important for the guys that get called at 2 o'clock in the morning. We want to make sure that the appropriate logging is going on. And we also want to make sure that the proper management is happening as well, whether we plug in SCOM or those type of things. Next, integrate using your service bus or caching. And then verify your migration and make sure everything is working well. Okay, so there's good news. There's tools that help with this. We take advantage of all the tools available to ensure that proper and successful Azure platform migration. So let's review some of those tools available. There's the SQL Azure migration tool, Azure SDK for Visual Studio, Tallan Azure Deployment Framework, Azure Storage Service Tools, and Migration Analysis Tools. SQL Azure Migration Wizard. This wizard is available for free, and it's available on Coplex. This remarkable tool performs script analysis. It identifies and fixes discrepancies between SQL Server and SQL Azure requirements. And for the most part, SQL Azure is compatible with SQL Azure 2008 R2, but it adds some additional restraints, including, for example, all tables must be clustered indexed. After the tool creates the scripts, it will actually create the SQL objects on SQL Azure Server. Finally, the data is BCP from your on-premise SQL Server to SQL Azure. So we've migrated databases with over 1,000 SQL Server objects in less than 30 minutes to 45 minutes. So the tool is really remarkable. Next, Azure SDK for Visual Studio. So the Visual Studio SDK 1.4 and 1.5 is required, or one of them, typically the latest, which is the 1.5, is required tool to move your .NET applications to Azure. It's essentially a Visual Studio plugin that allows you to create your cloud projects and provides a cloud emulator to debug. And then finally it provides a way to deploy your package. You can create the package or deploy it straight to Azure. The Tallan Azure Deployment Framework, this is something that we've created. We've created this framework to easily change configuration settings and deploy to multiple environments. Again, this is going back to what I mentioned earlier about how this fits in your SDLC and your deployment. So, for example, this really eased the deployment to those multiple environments, including your dev, stage, and production. Additionally, this utilizes MS Build, PowerShell scripts to seamlessly work with TFS builds, so this framework can come in handy, especially if you want to integrate something like continuous integration for your Azure application. Azure Storage Services tools. There are many Azure Storage Service tools out there, and they're free on Coplex. These really provide an interface to view and manage Azure storage services, including blobs, queues, and tables. Additionally, Tallan has a storage framework that allows you to upload directory-level static content, such as your images, your CSS files, and your JavaScript files, for example. Once those files are added, they can be used by the Azure Content Delivery Network, or CDN, to eliminate sending that static content over the wire per data center. So pretty powerful stuff there. Migration analysis tools. There's a TCO tool available, as I mentioned, on Microsoft's website, and it's free download. This invaluable tool will help you in your TCO planning and ROI estimates. The migration analysis tools, or MAT. If you're not sure your application should be migrated, this tool will help you in that decision process by walking you through a series of wizard steps. It provides an in-depth report for the final decision process. Pretty good stuff there. The Migration Assessment Planning, or MAP tool. So the Migration Assessment Planning, or MAP tool, can be set up to monitor your existing applications and provide those crucial data elements necessary for making those decision process. Again, this is a wizard, steps through and allows you to look at the scenario statuses that you can enable through the planning. Okay, next I'd like to walk you through a few tools and go through some of this. So here is what you see when you open up the MAP, or the Microsoft Assessment and Planning tool. Again, this allows you to monitor some of that data and prepare for that migration. You can see on the left there's where it takes your data collection and inventory. You can plug in your servers, your virtualization, cloud, database. And then in the middle you can see the steps to complete, so it gives you that as you go along. Pretty nice tool. And next I'd like to show you the Implement SQL Azure Migration Wizard. This remarkable tool can take your on-premise SQL Server, relational tables, and your store procedures, and move the data to, as I mentioned, to Azure in hardly any time. So very powerful tool. It walks you through. We can go through a few steps here. You can select that it's a SQL Server database, and actually, I think my screen is cut off here at the bottom. So what this does is you'll see a series of migration steps where you select your source SQL Server, and then there's some options where you would set for creating the scripts for the objects. So there's some options you can set there. You can just create the script, for example. But then later you can select your SQL Azure account, and it'll deliver the objects and all of the data for you when you're done with this tool. Okay, next I'd like to run you through setting up a simple MVC3 web application, and we'll see the SDK 1.5 Visual Studio tool in action as we create a cloud project and deploy it to our local cloud emulator. So let's go through that process. Let's create a new one. I think we got through that. MVC3 is okay, and that's default. It's fine. Okay, when that's said and done, we can, right out of the box, we could probably run this and everything should be okay. Once it completes, we'll go ahead and run this MVC3 application. And you can see at the bottom right, ASP.NET Development Server, localhost 49340 is starting. Okay, so there's our application, very simple. Let's go ahead and stop that and add a cloud. And this is really to demo the cloud project and the SDK. So let's go back and add a new project type. And for this, we're going to select cloud. Okay, if you don't already have a web application, for example, you can select one here and build that project as well. But since we've already have an application and we're really talking about migrating our current application, you can just hit OK for this. Now you can see that there's a new cloud project built, created. Now what this really does is it enables you to do the configuration for the cloud, tell Windows Azure how many instances, how large the instances should be. And so when you deploy this package, it really controls how the application is deployed and configured. So for this, we're going to create a role, and we're really going to associate it to our MVC3 application. So you can see web role, project, and solution, and we'll just select our MVC application 4. Okay. Now we have a web role that's associated to our web application. Now we can go into this and configure some of the properties. Again, this is just, we're going to configure this for the local emulator, which is part of the SDK as well. So pretty nice tool to basically go through and get your application up and running, debug it through some of the common issues, connect in through your Azure storage services, test that. You can actually connect through the emulator to your live Azure storage services as well. So you can do it different combinations. One of the approaches we also do is the first thing that I mentioned in the checklist was migrate SQL Azure. So what you'll want to do is change those connection strings. It still uses TDS or tabular data stream. So you would simply add the connection string for your SQL Azure and run that as a test, right off the bat. So what you'll end up with in the first step is a application that's running on premise with a SQL Azure background. So you can do this in steps. Here you can see just a basic configuration. We have how many instances. So I can make this 10 if I really expect this to do a lot of volume right off the bat. When I deploy this to Azure, because it's a platform as a service, it'll spin up all of those instances and create the VLAN, create the load balancer. All of that's automated. So again, platform as a service, we're only concerned about managing the application. And here we can select, if we want an extra large, for example. So let's just keep it small, and we can do maybe 2 instances, and we can save that. Now, at this point, when we run the application, it's going to run under the cloud emulator. And what that does is it emulates what it would be doing in Azure. So let's go ahead and run the application. So at first glance, you'll notice that the local host, the same port, the ASP.NET development server is not running. Right now it's configuring the Windows Azure debugging environment, the compute instances, and also the storage services. So it'll take just under a minute to run the first time it configures it. And right now it's basically building a local presentation of what it would be in the cloud. Okay. And you can see in the bottom here the application is being deployed. It's simulating. It's being deployed to the cloud. In this case, again, it's the local emulator. And then a couple things while we're waiting for that is that you can see that the compute emulator is started. Okay, so now this is our application. You can notice that the IP is different. It's 127.0.0.2 on port 81. All of that's configurable as well. And you can see that we have our application running out on the cloud. Now, one thing we can do is we can go into this emulator, for example, and we can show the compute emulator UI. This is really representing what the Azure portal would show, a very simplified version of it. So we can open that up. And we can see, here's my latest. I'll close that one. We can see that now we have two instances running. And again, this is, the VLAN's created, the virtuals are created, the application is deployed to both servers, and it's load balanced right off the bat. All right, let's stop that. Okay, and then the final thing I'd like to show you is the portal itself. Here we have a few applications, but just to give you a quick tour, if you haven't seen it, at first glance, there's a deployment health. There's affinity groups, which is your storage affinity groups. You can sort of logically create your storage services into, let's say, the North region. Where you manage your certificates, again, this is all about security and how that's managed. We also have all of your hosted services. So this is where your applications are deployed and all of your compute instances, as we just saw, being deployed out there. Where you manage your storage accounts. So this is, again, Azure is a stateless paradigm, so all your storage needs to be done through the tables and blobs. And then you can also utilize the queues in your architecture as well. So that's the basic tour there. You also have where you access SQL Azure. There's a tab here on the left. There's a new data sync service coming your way. Reporting within your application. And App Fabric, Service Bus, Access Control, and Caching, setting that up. And then following your virtual network, so a couple new things here, if you haven't seen it in 4, 5, 6 months. One thing particular is not only there's a feature called Connect, where you can connect your applications to your on-premise applications, but one interesting thing is the traffic manager as well. And what that does, it allows you to load balance, for example, or create failover scenarios for a resilient application on the cloud. For example, you want to have a fault resilient application that's running in another data center, and maybe you want that to be the failover, for example. So this allows you to either have both running in both data centers and configure it where it basically serves up the request based on the user's location, so performance. It also can do just a round robin, which means it just alternates it, or it can do a failover situation. So once you figure out how warm or how hot your failover site is going to be for using data sync services and that type of thing. So this really, that could be a whole nother webinar on fault tolerance. But just to give you a little glimpse into that. Okay, so with that, I'm going to get back into the presentation. So Tallan and Microsoft have partnered to help grow your business in the cloud. Tallan is one of the few partners accepted in the U.S. Azure Circle program, so you may be eligible for some Microsoft or Tallan consulting to help rocket you in the clouds for that. Also, some of the other services, you can really leverage Tallan to help you with all your Azure needs. We can help lay that groundwork and get you started, or design, develop, deploy your first application to get you going. Our in-depth knowledge of SOA, BizTalk, connected systems can enable those extended capabilities in the cloud as the need integrates with the on-premise applications. And as always, Tallan is committed to enabling our clients, and we can help by offering some kind of mentoring service as we go along the way. Okay, so I'd like to recap. In summary, I'd really like to give you 3 key takeaways when planning your next Azure platform migration. First, perform an exhaustive analysis. Migration to Azure is not a trivial task and requires appropriate planning. So engage with an experienced Microsoft Go partner and reduce that risk and leverage the proven experience. Select the application that is small, it's not complicated for the first migration. This will allow you to walk through a full migration while mitigating risk. Also, this will set the stage for your new Azure development, SDLC, and will ensure future migrations are successful. Next, take advantage of all of the tools available at your fingertips. Most of them are free and available on Microsoft and Coplex websites. The tools play a big role in a successful Azure deployment, and they reduce the migration time tremendously. Finally, be aware of those hidden costs that I mentioned that can chip away at your ROI. So you can avoid those hidden costs through education. There's plenty of forums, there's plenty of information out there. Solid cloud architecture is very important, and appropriate cloud management. Some of those include some of the dimensions of pricing. Make sure you understand all of those dimensions of pricing. What we call leaving the faucet on, quote unquote. Really, that's about having services that are running or stopped, for example, but they're still deployed. So a suspended application is still being billed, for example. Staging, for example, costs the same as production. And compute charges are not based on usage. Again, that's, if it's deployed, it's deployed. And you will be charged for that. And then SLA requires at least 2 instances. The service level agreement of the 3.5 nines requires that, for example, if you deploy a web application, that application must have at least 2 web roles, for example. And then one other thing is polling is expensive. So if you have an application that's doing a ton of polling, every 5 seconds, then just be aware and plan and architect that appropriately. And then what I'd like to do is give a few plugs here to our upcoming webinars. Following our popular Part 1 SharePoint Information Architecture webinar, we'll be presenting SharePoint Series Part 2, Creating Engaging Intranet Communities, on January 11th. We found that those who are interested in Azure are also interested in business intelligence. So on January 25th, we'll be presenting visualized KPIs with SQL Server 2012 analysis services. And then, as you probably know, the SQL Server 2012 will be released next year. Some members of the Tallan team are currently writing the Microsoft Press Book on SQL Server 2012, and we'll be sharing that with you and how you can build semantic models using 2012. To sign up for any of these events, visit tallan.com/events or email webinars@tallan.com.